right, it's a little after 7 and we've got a significant majority of folks here. So I think we can go ahead and get started. So, and we're already recording. Thank you, Eli. That's great. I'm going to go ahead and get us going. So welcome everyone to the second meeting of our task force on reimagining public safety. I'm Mayor Weaver, and whether you are joining us here on the screen or tuning in on the YouTube channel, we are glad you're with us. It's great to see all your faces here on the screen. To me, it feels like a long time since we had our first meeting. And I know that after we met that first meeting, I really felt like, let's just, it seemed like a long time to wait for another meeting. So here we are. And we can officially get going with a roll call. Oh, Eli, can you do the roll call? Sorry.
Yes, I will do the roll call.
Thank you.
No problem. Please excuse me if I mess up a name. Judith Alvarado. Judith has waved hello. Keith Cook.
Yes.
Sujata Bijou.
Here.
Shannon Blue. Shannon Blue. Patricia Harrison. Patricia has waved hello. Chloe Johnson.
Good evening.
Rod Jones. Rod Jones. Jason Knapp.
Here.
Tracy Little. Tracy is waving hello. Hathaway Pendergrass.
Hey, everybody.
David Schultz.
Hooper, hey y'all.
Mark Xavier.
Yeah.
Allison Zirkle.
Here.
Mayor Weaver.
I am here.
And Chief Hampton.
No, I'm present.
Welcome, everyone. And I just want to make a note that, oh goodness, I lost my Mariana Alcazar. I believe I'm saying her last name correctly, but I don't have it right in front of me. She was with us at our first meeting, but has let us know she's not going to be able to continue. So sorry to be missing her, but that is a change. And I also just want to welcome Keith Cook, who is the appointed representative from the Northern Orange branch of the NAACP to this group. And also welcome Mark Xavier, who wasn't able to be with us last time, but is here tonight. It's great to have y'all with us. And I believe everybody else was here at our first meeting, so it's good to see you all back together. We are going to be talking about mental health, that general subject tonight. And this is, something that has been a recurring topic of conversation and thinking about public safety and needing to think about how the needs of both community members and law enforcement are being met or not met, and thinking about that aspect. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So thank you everyone for being in here. And I know you got the readings, and I promise I'm going to stop thanking you for being here. That might be about the 4th or 5th time, but I'm just excited to see you again. And our first our only item for official decision tonight right now is to approve the minutes from our first meeting. Do we have a motion to approve the minutes?
Motion to approve?
Thank you. Is there a second?
I'll second the motion.
Thank you, Chloe. And then we can roll call that vote. And I also just want to say that for several of us in here, we kind of go through this moving to approve and seconds of motions and taking the vote. It's very routine for us. So I just want to acknowledge it's not necessarily routine for everyone in your daily lives. So it's a pretty simple process. You just make a motion, someone seconds it, and then we'll roll call the vote. If we were together in a room, we could just, raise our hands or do a voice vote. But because there's particular rules that come with our remote meetings, so we have to roll call it by name. So that's just for explanation's sake. So if Eli, if you could roll call that, please.
Judith Alvarado,
Yes.
Keith Cook,
I wasn't here, but I read them and it's good with me.
Sujata Bijou,
Yes.
Patricia Harrison,
Yes.
Chloe Johnson,
Yes.
Rod Jones, not here, Jason Knapp,
Yes.
Casey Little,
Yes. Yes.
Hathaway Pendergrass,
Aye.
David Schultz,
Yes. Eli, would you mind referring to me as Hooper?
okay, Hooper Schultz.
Yes.
Sorry about that. Mark Xavier,
Here, I'm here.
and Allison Zirkle.
Yes.
Mayor Weaver,
I'm actually not a voting member in case there's a tie. So except for
Okay.
when there's a tie. So I won't vote on this one, but that is approved unanimously.
very good.
Thank you. And so the next item on our agenda is a presentation from Chief Hampton to give us kind of an overview and context of mental health calls and the Hillsborough Police Department. And the information that you sent out, Chief, was really helpful. I really appreciated that, both the data and the anecdotal stories. So maybe you could just go through that with us and then give everyone a chance to ask questions. And Keith, if you're able to, if you could put your mic on mute, that just takes out some of the background noise, I think. Thank you.
All right. Are you ready for me, I guess? Well, let me start by apologizing in advance. I did not, I guess, pay close enough attention. I was thinking I was just providing you guys the printed information and somebody else was presenting. So this is not going to be as good as it should be. I apologize in advance. Basically, Eli actually pulled a lot of this information together. The idea being just give you a kind of an idea of what the volume, I guess, anecdotally of what we respond to, a little bit of information about when it happens, a little bit of information about how it relates to use of force situations, and a little bit about our training. If anybody has a question while I'm talking, I've actually got my screen up so I can see the information, so I can't see you all right now. So Mayor or somebody, if you would just cut in if I need to stop, please.
I'll definitely let you know. I'll keep my eye out.
Perfect. Team effort. Thank you. Basically looking at, 2020, we pulled the information. There's a little bit of a caveat to this in that, none of these data systems that we use are really perfectly clean systems. In fact, they're very imperfect in a lot of ways. We don't control our dispatch information, so we are at the mercy of however a telecommunicator puts this information in the computer. And they do a great job, but they have to make a classification based on really very little information a lot of times. So we pulled the data from 2020 and basically tagged some key things. There are probably more stuff that is mental health related that we respond to. And some of these things may have ended up really not being mental health related, but I think it's a good benchmark. We basically had about 173 calls, be it a mental health call, an overdose, a suicide attempt, or an involuntary commitment. Those were kind of the big benchmarks we used. About 102 of them ended up being something where there was a lot of interaction with somebody in crisis. Averaged about one every 3 or 4 days, somewhere in that ballpark. We had 72 incident reports in the system, and that's where the officers went to a call and ended up having to really do something. There was something to it. There was something, some nature that needed to be documented. So it gives you kind of an idea, and just to give the frame of reference, I don't have the 2020 call volume numbers in front of me, but on average, it's 15 or 16,000 calls a year. So just to give you an idea of volume, it's not a huge chunk in and of itself, but a fairly frequent and recurring thing. In terms of calls our officers are dispatched to, it's probably a more significant chunk. We kind of looked a little bit at the nature of these calls that we had, these 102 calls that really ended up having something to it. We could find information on. I guess that's the best way to describe it. Biggest chunk of them are what are considered involuntary commitments. This is where somebody is going to have to be compelled to go get treatment of some form, some sort of mental health treatment. For our officers, it's generally a process. Most of the time, it's a process where we pick up papers from the magistrate's office. These papers direct our officer to go get this person at this address and take them to a designated mental health provider. Typically, it's the hospital. That's where we take them about 99% of the time. These involuntary commitments can also be what are considered emergencies, and that's where the officer goes and this person needs help now, and there's no time to go get papers. So basically, if they're a clear danger to themselves or others, and it's imminent that we need to do something, the officers can take the person into custody, compel them, essentially take them to the hospital, and then we do the paperwork kind of on the back end of things. About 30 of these calls, the second biggest chunk were what are considered voluntary commitments. This is where somebody calls, they're in crisis, and they agree to go get help. Our officers spend a lot of time trying to talk to people and encourage them to go get help on their own, because that's the best situation really for everybody. Similar size chunk were ended up being reports that are just considered a crisis intervention team response, where somebody's in crisis and needs referral, needs information. We usually will document it, put them in touch with some other provider. And then there were some of them that had other nature, not a significant number. So one of the things we looked at was the idea of just a little bit of information about time of day and day of the week. In terms of day of the week, it's fairly spread out. These kind of calls happen all the time, every day of the week. Mondays seem to be the highest, and it looks like Sundays were kind of the lowest, but they're all within about 10 calls of each other, so fairly consistent. Time of day, some variation there. Obviously, fewer of them in the wee hours of the morning, more of them in the 6 p.m. to midnight kind of say. So the basic pull we got from this is we have just as many of these calls outside of your normal Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, when most of your providers and services are available, as we do during those times. Okay. We provided some anecdotal information in the printout, just the idea being to give you just kind of a snapshot of what the officers may run into. It's a lot of different things that we get. No two calls for assistance are ever kind of the same. They go from calls of somebody having suicidal thoughts, and we'll get information third hand. We'll spend a lot of time trying to find information and track it down. Now, a lot of times somebody will make a statement to a friend or a neighbor or a relative or somebody who gets concerned, and then they call us. So a lot of times we're not even getting information directly. We've had a lot of situations where, officers responded to people who had weapons and were suicidal. Across the country, we've had a lot of situations where folks have taken or tried to take their own life by getting an officer to kill them. We've had a few situations where, we think folks had that intention, but fortunately we responded well and were able to keep that from happening. We've had folks trying to jump off the I-85 bridge, and we've had to have officers kind of talk them down. A lot of times we've had folks that, we get there with papers and they run, or they try to, essentially don't want to go get the help that the papers require them to. So there's, like I said, there's some anecdotal examples in there of different things that our officers run into, and we've seen, kind of a little bit of almost everything at one point or another. In terms of uses of force, and I know this is where a lot of the focus folks have is, on use of force and dealing with people in mental crisis. We had 6 situations where some sort of force was used. All of it was fairly, I don't want to say minor, but it was physical force situations where the officers had to hold somebody down or restrain them. Most of them were folks that were trying to just run. They weren't necessarily trying to hurt or assault the officers, but they didn't want to go get the paper served. They didn't want to go talk to the doctor. So that's what a lot of them, some of the cases were juveniles, where parents have called and gone and gotten commitment papers, and they don't tell the kid, and we show up, and it becomes kind of a mess after that. So we've been fortunate. None of ours have really resulted in a significant injury of any sort. Usually they're not fighting with the officer, directly. Sometimes, like I said, after we're trying to restrain them to take them down there, they may be fighting with the officers. We've had a few situations, and we haven't had one in 2020, but I remember in 2019, we had a couple of situations where officers ended up having to use force to try to keep somebody from running into the road to hurt themselves. We had actually 2 of those in 2019, I think. So overall, it's a fairly small number of use of force incidents, but the problem with these situations is they can be so volatile. Folks are already in a crisis situation, and things can spin out of control really, really fast. Just a quick snapshot of training. All law enforcement officers have training in dealing with response to, mental illness, developmental difficulties, folks in crisis. The Basic Academy has a specific block. It's about 24 hours. And then, it's woven. A lot of these things are woven into a lot of other areas. Use of force training involves de-escalation and, communication skills. All these different areas are kind of woven in. We have a dealing with victims in the public, which also brings in some of this. Domestic violence brings in some of it. So even though there's only one block dedicated to it, it's woven into a lot of the things they do in the Basic Academy. Once the officers are out in the field, we have annual in-service. The topics are typically set by the state, and they usually give us certain required ones and then a slate of options we can pick from. The topics will change year from year, but generally speaking, there's generally 2 to 6 hours of mental illness response or de-escalation at a minimum every year. Worst case, every other year. I'd have to really do some digging to go back through the previous trainings to kind of get the exact numbers, but typically every year, every other year, there's a couple of courses that deal with these kind of topics. One of the courses that we're working to get all of our officers through, and we're not alone, this is true of most of the law enforcement in North Carolina, is trying to get everybody through crisis intervention training. This is a week-long class. It's done as a partnership through law enforcement, the community college mental health providers. But it's a great class. It provides really a lot of instruction about dealing with people in crisis. It's scenario-based training, a lot of hands-on activities. It focuses on resources, de-escalation. It's a tough class to put on, though, so usually you only get it put on in this area about once or twice a year. And everybody wants to go in their home area because, again, it's all about the resources that we have available to us here. So typically, 1 or 2 times a year, we get this course offered. We can usually only get 1 or 2 officers into each session, simply because they do limit it. They're trying to give everybody a chunk. I think right now, 13 of our 19 patrol officers have completed this training. We do have a lot of young officers that just haven't been able to get to it yet, especially with COVID having pretty much canceled it for the last, year now. But our goal is to get 100% of our staff trained and ready to go. So that is kind of a summary of the information. Let me see if I can get back. I know I went through that super fast. So I think that's what I've got. So I think the floor is to questions, I guess. That might be the best way to explore forward.
Sujata, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for that. That was really eye-opening and helpful. So thank you for pulling that all together and presenting it. I have a lot of questions, but I'm just going to start off with one basic one and then give others a chance, and then maybe I can ask some more. I'm pretty new to learning about law enforcement, and the other day my daughter and I were looking up the difference between sheriffs and police. What I understand is you were giving the information for Hillsborough Police, but then is there overlap with the Orange County Sheriff that would add another layer of these type of incidents happening?
I guess the short answer to that is maybe. I'm sorry to be vague. Generally speaking, any 911 call for service that happens inside the town limits, we're going to respond to. So, generally we're going to respond to most of those calls. It's not unheard of for a deputy to be, to encounter someone and handle it. A lot of times they'll encounter them and just call us, and then we handle it. It's kind of a team effort. Most of the stuff that we do, the stuff I quoted there, is pretty representative of what we have within the town limits. I can't speak to the county's data. They have their own problems with these same things because they cover pretty much all the unincorporated areas. So I know, like I said, I know from just experience, they're at the magistrate's office picking up commitment papers just like we are to go serve on people. They're encountering folks in crisis just like we are. Typically we handle what happens within the town limits. We may call them to assist, but it's still going to be in our data usually. Theoretically, everything I said should be Hillsborough. There may be a couple of occasional outliers that they've helped with, but not too many. Usually if they're helping, they're assisting us.
Chloe, and then Mark, do you have your hand up also?
Yes.
Okay, Chloe and then Mark.
Okay, I just have a kind of background question. I noticed in the data that it said from 2019 to 2020, there was a rate of increase of 38% for the calls, mental health or crisis calls. And I'm wondering, just from obviously you probably haven't done a specific analysis on this, but from what you know, is that due to the nature of 2020, or is that something with how the data was reported? Maybe there was a change in how data was captured. Do you have any insight into that increase?
I'm sorry, would you like to repeat the percentage? 36, you said? 36%?
38% increase.
All right, thank you.
This past year.
There we go. I don't know that I can speak really specifically to it. Again, our numbers are low, so it doesn't take a lot to make a big percentage change for us. Anecdotally, I think all of us have seen a lot more issues and people having crisis and problems in 2020. It was a tough year for everybody. But I don't have a specific analysis of that. And we didn't have time to pull together enough trend information over time either. There's also some variation, that what is considered a CIT call, as we call it, has evolved a little bit over the years. When it was first new, the criteria were a little bit different. So there are things that may not have been reported, but I think it's just climate. I think we've just seen a bit of an increase in them because of the climate around, but I haven't done a more detailed analysis than that.
Yes. My question is, what about, I don't know, maybe I missed it, but I'm very interested into the demographics as to, out of the, what is it, 170, 302, what are the demographics within those calls, right? Locations, race, age, genders, all those things. I think it would be very helpful to actually have the data, and once we have it, then once you have it, then you can actually analyze it. So, what about the demographics? Do you have any data on that?
The data exists, but we didn't pull it together for this meeting. We can get you guys that though. Eli, correct me if I'm wrong. We haven't pulled that level of data in this stuff yet.
That's right, not for the CIT.
And again, a lot of the problem is data in these systems is not at our fingertips in a lot of ways. Sometimes it's going to require us, to go through the report. Every report you have to go through and read the whole report, honestly, to pull out a lot of the data sometimes, because there may be multiple people involved in a report, and only one of those people may be the person in crisis. So trying to figure out exactly who that is, but we can pull that data. We just haven't had time to do that yet before this meeting.
All right, thank you.
I think I'll just throw in, this is a bit of a side comment, but it's been some topic of discussion in the past couple of budget cycles with the town board about, when questions like this have come up before about, asking for data from the police department. Just because we're very small, we, currently our department doesn't have access to kind of easy, sophisticated data software. Is that the simplest way of putting it, Eli and Chief? So there's been some discussion about that topic and kind of the bang for the buck as far as should we decide to fund something like that and partnership opportunities, things like that. So I'm oversimplifying that, but just to give you an idea that it's not always easy to pull what we need.
Great, I understand. But what I was one of the reasons that I asked the question was that because North Carolina is expected to increase in terms of population, right? So by having 100 and 200 and 173 calls, right, on average, then highly predictably, there's gonna be higher numbers when the population starts to grow because there are so many constructions going on, all over the place in Hillsborough, right? So that was one of the reasons that I asked for, because I see that it will come along the way. So if there are possibilities to actually collect data and then actually analyze it for the long term, I think it will be very beneficial to the town.
I think that's right. I think that's a great question and point, Mark. And and just to remember that one of the things that's woven into all the work that we're doing here and why we're convened is, I think, particularly to look at racial disparities in those demographics. And so, thank you for making that point and asking that question. Cooper.
Yeah, this is actually a question about the police department's use of force policy. And I noticed that there's an item that says that every 5 years after the fact, all these incident reports are purged. And I was wondering if that's just a record keeping kind of thing, but also whether that's something that has been discussed as something that might not be good in terms of keeping track of, because if there's only 100 incidents in a year, that's not really that many incidents where a police officer, if they have a pattern of excessive use of force, really gets in front of somebody who's having a crisis. So I'm wondering if there's been discussion about pushing that to a longer record keeping about use of force.
As far as I know, there haven't been any specific discussions. That's the North Carolina state retention. And actually, I think their retention rule is 2 or 3 years. And really that generally means, we get rid of a piece of paper. The data is, for most part, is still captured. The incident report that is written that's connected to that use of force, they don't go away. They stay in our records management system. So while it says that, it's a little misleading. The data still exists for the most part. We're not going to throw that data away. The records that an officer was involved in a particular use of force, that information is retained.
Sujata.
I was wondering, in relationship to the use of force, you have the denominator for this is the crisis intervention responses. I was wondering for the bigger denominator in kind of the reverse, instead of the crisis intervention responses, how much force was used, the reverse of the reports of use of force, how many were crisis intervention responses, if that makes sense. I said that kind of
sorry.
So I can
if you could clarify that a little bit.
I want to know if the 6 cases here are all of the cases of use of force, or if there's a larger pool of use of force cases.
You mean use of force that doesn't involve CIT or
Exactly.
mental health? Oh yeah, yes. Certainly there are more uses of force.
So that's my question: is how big is that? Or how many?
Bear with me a second. 34 in 2020, I think.
Yeah, that's 2020.
Yeah, 34.
Okay, so about 1 star for.
And just to be clear, the discussion about use of force needs to be a much bigger discussion. What defines a use of force in Hillsborough is very different, I think, than what defines a use of force in a lot of other places. I came from Durham when I came to Hillsborough. I came from a different work. I've also worked at the airport as a police officer. Every agency sets their own, for the most part, definitions and thresholds. While we have a lot of things that are in common, we require a review on things that many other agencies never even look at. So just understand that our number of 34 includes a lot of stuff where an officer never put their hands on anyone. We look at things even like the display of a firearm or the display of a taser, where other agencies don't do that. So it is important to understand that the definition is not clear apples to apples across agencies as well. But 2020, we had 34. We've got the data for other years. I just don't have it at my fingertips. We put that in our annual report that information out to the board every year as well, and go through kind of all the incidents. So I have, all those presentations. I can provide you all that information when we get to that without any trouble. And I guess, did I answer your question? I'm sorry.
Yes, you did. I'm sorry I asked it in such a weird way.
Allison.
Yeah, I just had a question about the training. You said that the topics are given by the state. And so I was just wondering if that means the state is determining that like all of the police departments have to do these annual trainings and whatever topics they choose. And then I'm also wondering the state, is that like the state police something or other, or what exactly is that body?
All of our, basically, every law enforcement officer in North Carolina is certified through what is called the North Carolina Education and Training Standards Commission. we call it training and standards. They set the curriculum for basic law enforcement training. So they set, exactly what it is. They define those lesson plans. And then in terms of in-service, they mandate certain things. I can't remember off the top of my head. It's I think in total it's 24 hours a year, and they mandate specifically somewhere around 12 to 16 hours of that. And that includes our firearms use of force training, generally includes what's called juvenile minority sensitivity training. It's changed forms over the years. It's not as clearly what it sounds like. Its topical area changes each year. There's legal updates where they go through all the case laws and new law updates from previous year. There's one or two others that show up pretty much every year. They're annual classes we take. And then that remaining hours is stuff that they usually give us, a list of about 6 or 7 lesson plans that they've put together, and agencies can kind of choose and pick from them which ones they want to do with their officers. So they give us a little bit of leeway in those areas as well. I think it's usually 2 or 3 that we get to choose from their slated list. A lot of times we do more because they're all available online. They've got a really good online training platform that we use. So we usually try to get our officers through that and actually exceed that number every year. And I hope I answered that. Sorry, I'm very rambly tonight.
Thank you. Yeah.
Chloe.
Chief Hampton, I'm wondering how you and maybe other officers, as far as you can speak on it, you saw the readings that we were doing most likely, and we're talking, the discussion is going to be about alternatives to police responding to these types of calls. And you mentioned how volatile these situations can get. They don't always get. A small percentage last year got what you had to use force. So I assume those were the volatile situations. Do you think that, or do you ever feel that officers are not, even with this training, prepared for these types of situations? Do you feel like there's a skill set that is not provided? That is there a feeling like more different types of people, social workers and people trained in mental health, like therapists, would be better at responding? I'm just interested in your take on alternative models for dealing with these types of calls.
That is an interesting series of questions to unpack. I'll be honest. I don't think there's a police officer on the planet that would love to never have to respond to another one of these kind of calls. They are, a challenging call. They're not a fun call. We see a lot of the same people in crisis over and over and over. So it's really easy to feel like you're not really doing anything to move the needle. We're not really helping these people. It's just a cycle for them. There are a lot of bad things that can go wrong on these calls. And a lot of times it's stuff that we have no control over. In the last 10 years with the high increase in, this whole idea of suicide by cop, again, the officers are on edge sometimes because, folks are using us to take care of their own lives, and that becomes a real long-term challenge. In terms of how well the officers respond, I'm going to be honest. I think considering what they're up against, they do an amazing job. I cannot tell you how many reports I've read where these officers have spent time talking to people, talking them down, talking them into getting help. These calls eat up, 2 or 3 hours of an officer's night sometimes. And a lot of times they spend that time really working with people. And they have to do it at, 2 o'clock in the morning with 5 minutes notice, with no information on these people's history. They have to go into this situation with no preparation in the way that, most of your social workers and your other folks get, time to prepare to respond to this. In some ways, it amazes me that I can send a 21 or 22-year-old young man out in the middle of the night into a house and into a world, he does not know the person, doesn't know anything about it, has, very little life experience to draw on, and they really get it right so much of the time. I've read a lot of stuff about the alternative models, and I think it would be fantastic to find an alternative model. The problem is I don't know how that works. I don't know how you do that. How do you have somebody available, a team of people available all the time who can go and respond to this kind of call in the amount of time that we have? It's not like 30 minutes, 45 minutes for everybody to get called at home, wake up, get dressed, go out. It's 5 or 6 minutes. You got to be there. Person's in crisis. So, you're talking about people who have to be available all the time and just waiting for that call. And it's one call every 3 or 4 days for us. The big thing I think to me, is that this is our problem as a town of Hillsborough. We suffer from this problem, but it's not going to be ours to solve. This has to be a bigger solution in my mind. This has to be countywide, regional, statewide. That's where the real solution to this problem is going to be. But again, I still go back to, from my experience, the people I've worked with, watching some of these young men and women handle these calls and help at least put out the fire of crisis is just amazing to me. I think they do an amazing job with what they're up against. I don't know that I think anyone else would be able necessarily to do better. We can always use more training, but it is one of those things where, again, it's something that happens. If it happens once every 3 or 4 days to one officer, that's, for one officer, it might not show up but once every other month, depending on the rotation, the schedule, if they get the call. So it's tough to keep the training sharp and ready. It's basic fundamentals that we keep training on that they put into practice, whether it's de-escalation, verbal judo, different ways to communicate. It's that training is not just for mental health, it's for talking to people. And that's what we have to focus on. And I'll be quiet now.
So, may I
Wait,
ask a
Mark, I think Jason had his hand up.
sorry.
Okay, that's okay, Jason, and then Mark.
My question is kind of similar to the last question, but I was just wondering how much more deliberate are officers usually in the use of force continuum when they determine whether or not a situation would require use of force, or is it just the same as dealing with a normal case? I mean, I know that it's not, but how does that process differ?
Can you give me a little bit more? I just want to make sure I understand the question. Sorry, I'm being a little hard-headed tonight.
No, you're okay. So this was actually something that I learned about last year in class. So I might not be the best at explaining it. But I remember the use of force continuum to have 6 levels. The first level is officer presence, and then tactical communication or verbal judo, like I think you were talking about, and then physical control and defensive weapons, disengagement, and lethal force. How much more deliberate or thorough is that process with CITs compared to just normal cases?
That's a difficult question to probably answer clearly. Use of force in general is intended to be reactionary to the resistance an officer is facing. So, in theory, if the officer is facing, resistance, whether it's someone who is in a crisis situation and they pull out a gun and point it at an officer versus somebody who's just evil and out to kill people and points a gun at an officer, the decision process is probably about the same. It's a split second running of choices and options that I can't even articulate very well. When you deal with situations where it's somebody who's just trying to run away from the police, I think, and again, I have no way to characterize or prove this, I don't think, but I think, there's a difference in how an officer might approach, a shoplifting suspect that pushes them and tries to run away versus how they may approach a 13-year-old kid whose parents have just surprised him with commitment papers, who pushes the officer and tries to run away. Ultimately, the end result has to kind of be the same. The officers have to get control of that person. I think in every situation, our officers are very conscious, very cognizant about the idea of, we don't want to hurt somebody. We want to get them under control in a lot of these physical situations. So when it comes to the mental commitments, most of the uses of force are a matter of simply trying to get somebody under control, trying to hold on to them. And honestly, usually what we do is we wrap them up and we hold on to them until they get tired, and then we can get them into custody. That's what I see over and over and over. Now, there is an additional component when you're dealing with mental health in that, the force we can use in a mental health situation is kind of tempered a little bit by, the fact that this is a person that needs to get help. So it's kind of counterintuitive to hurt them in the process of trying to get them help. We're not going to be using, high levels of force and end up hurting a person worse by trying to serve a commitment paper on them than the danger they may present. A lot of times in the involuntary commitment situation where the officers have papers, we have a lot of information. We kind of know what's going on. A lot of times that's why you'll see usually, if we're serving a commitment paper, to be honest, pretty much everybody we have available is probably going to go, because it's a lot easier to control the situation. And if somebody does try to run, you got 2 or 3 officers just holding on to them, we're not going to hurt them that way. We're just going to be able to keep them under control. If one officer's there and is in danger of getting overpowered, it starts to change the equation. And some of these folks can be extremely strong. Even some of the kids have shown incredible strength sometimes. So in theory, yes. In theory, again, there's a limit probably to how much force would be used. The officer is going to have to realize, okay, this is, I'm not going to strike this person. That's counterintuitive to what we're trying to do. I'm not going to restrain them so badly that we're going to cause an injury to them. So there is, a little bit of a nexus in that area. But again, if it becomes a life and death type situation, where, this person is essentially, like a suicide by cop, the officers are going to have to assess every situation. There's not a one size fits all. I myself personally might hesitate a heartbeat if I think that's what this person is trying to do, but that's a personal risk I'm taking. It's not unheard of if the officers don't act in those situations, that the person doesn't start shooting somebody to get them to act. And that's happened. So they're tough situations. Most of what we deal with is fairly lower level, simply having to grab a hold of people. And generally, yes, our officers know this is a kid or a person in crisis who's trying to run, and they're not going to be using high level techniques. Usually we're just going to keep scrapping and holding on to them until they get tired. Jason, did that help at all? I'm not sure if I quite got to the nature of what you were asking.
No, that was great. I was just wondering, because I heard your answer to the last person's question, and I might be misquoting here, but I heard you say like they'll pull the same tactics that they learned when they were in basic training, and obviously that makes sense. So I was just wondering how, like, if and when they would adjust that or sort of tweak that to deal with a crisis.
And that same adjustment would happen if the person officer's facing is 6'4" and 300 pounds versus somebody that's 5 foot and 100 pounds. what the officer does is going to be different. And that's part of what we train. It also will have to do with the officer. A really big officer may be able to may have more latitude in a lot of situations than a small officer, just because of size and strength. So there is a lot of constant adjustment that happens, and it does happen in these calls. It's just not an easy thing to measure, and short of anecdotal examples, it's not an easy way to show that happens, other than what we know from working in the field.
Yeah, and I'll make this quick, but that was definitely more of a just a personal experience question rather than like a can you pull this stat or fact type of question. So yeah, that was good.
Thanks, Jason. Okay, Mark.
Yes. Based on what you've mentioned so far, when you talked about the use of force, it's about by 6 out of 102. That's about close to 6%. I think that's pretty good. That's excellent in my view, based on what they have to deal with. And I think based on what you mentioned, I think the officers are doing a wonderful job into that aspect. My question is, though, you mentioned a few minutes ago about the training, right? You mentioned about the training, and my question is, because they have to take, a few classes, a few training courses, and the idea is in this particular situation is to try to get someone under control, right? So do you think, in your view, that the officers, I remember one of the trainings that you said that they have to, one is probably elective for them to take. My question is, do you think, in your view, even though you also mentioned that no amount of training, would actually prepare the officer for the 5 minutes they have to deal with it, which is true. I mean, I think that's 100% correct, because there is anyway. So my question is, do you think the officers receive the necessary training that they need to get the job done by dealing with the mental health situations?
I think we received the training needed to do the job. I think we could always train more. We push every year to do more and more training. I think the officers have so many things thrown at them that we have to train on, that we could probably train all year long and still not be, still have gaps. It's a lot of information that they have to know and respond to. And unfortunately, both staffing, budgets, and expertise all kind of limit how much training we can do. It's tough, because the reality is, in order to train, that means they're not working, or at least not working in terms of answering 911 calls. We try to do a little bit of training pretty much every month. We have kind of an every day is a training day mentality, where they do a little bit of roll call training every day, which is really short, a 10-minute, going over some critical aspect just to get the juices flowing. On the weekends, when it's a little quieter, they carve out a little bit more time. Sometimes late at night, they'll go out and they'll do, scenarios, and they do a lot of self-directed training. And then, at least on a quarterly basis, we're trying to do some in-house training. This is all kind of above whatever is mandated or online. This is, trying to get some sort of hands-on, decision-making, communications, different things. We did one probably 3 or 4 months ago. We did a traffic stop scenario training where we put them through kind of dealing with a sovereign citizen. These are folks that are the kind of anti-government, don't recognize the authority. We had an officer do a wonderful job kind of role playing as one of these people and giving the officers a chance to experience this, because it is a massively challenging thing. It is so easy to lose your temper, to get upset at what these people are saying. And the fact that they're not working, not complying with anything you're doing. The officers have to work their way through it. And being able to do that in training means that when we face that situation or something kind of similar in the field, we've already got some patterns to build on, some ideas of, of reaction and how things are going to work, so they're not caught completely off guard. We'll do the same thing with a lot of different scenarios like that, whether it's a use of force situation or, dealing with somebody who's in a crisis. So we do these kind of anecdotal in-house trainings from periodically throughout the year as well. I think North Carolina is way, way ahead of the curve compared to, I'm watching, since all of this has starting to hear about what all these other agencies are doing. And, I hear about this state, we've decided to mandate use of force training now. I'm like, what planet are you on? This is, at the time, 2020. I was like, what police agency statewide doesn't do use of force training? That's so foreign to me. I've been on a couple of different organizations nationally and talking with other places. So I think North Carolina has a pretty robust system. But to your point, Mark, I think we're prepared for a lot of what the officers face. There's always going to be things we encounter. There's things I encounter after 25, 26 years of doing this that never had that happen before, that, they're going to be unprepared for. But I think the basics are covered really, really well. I think we do a good job kind of keeping the supporting training, but we need more. I just don't know how we build it and get it to happen. But more training is definitely good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Chief, I wanted to ask you, and I think we're about at the point. I want people to feel like they've got other questions answered, where we might be ready to segue to the next item on the agenda here soon. But in the rotations that you have for the shifts for your officers, does it work? Because I can't. I know you have the stats of how many have had that CIT training. Do you try to schedule someone who has that training on each kind of shift, or are you just sort of trying to get people trained up as best you can when the opportunity arises?
We're trying to get them trained up as best we can, the opportunity. Our schedules, there is no consistency. It's a nightmare right now to make sure we've got people at work. Somebody calling out sick, anything can change the rotations around a lot for us. So it's kind of a shell game of moving pieces. Right now, it's pretty rare. I want to say almost never, but I don't want to say never because you never say never. But it is very, very rare that we would not have somebody at work who's had that training. Like I said, we've got a lot of folks in our patrol division that have been through the training. And then during the week, especially if you're talking Monday through Friday, all the folks who are in the administrative side of things and our detectives, a lot of them have also been through the training. So you have that additional support of extra people who can come out and respond when something happens. But right now, no, we really don't have a good way to try to, stay on top of making sure we've got that particular resource available. But I don't think we run into it as a problem very often.
Thank you. Other questions based, primarily on this information that came out that Eli pulled together and Chief Hampton has talked about so beautifully. Judith.
Yeah, I just had one question about, and it's more also related to the data, but.
Wait, Judith, I'm sorry. Can you turn up your mic just a little bit? It's a little bit hard to hear you.
Yeah, it might be my computer. Can you hear me now? Is that better? Okay. Yeah, I just had a question about, and I think it's more related to the data. I'm interested in seeing, I think Chief Hampton mentioned something along the lines that they get calls from the same individual several times. And so I would like to know if there's any information about how many of these people are calling for, for mental health crisis. I mean, I think it would be interesting to look at that and see if they are receiving the help that is needed instead of, you know, calling back and calling the police for these cases.
I can look, but honestly, that's not going to be our data. We don't get any information or feedback on what happens on the back end. Mental health is not in our realm at all. So if we, you know, we take somebody for treatment, rarely do we, you know if they got any help or not, or what the long-term plan is. You know, a lot of times our voluntary commitments, we don't even know for sure if they got seen. We get them to the hospital, but that's really, you know, kind of where our role ends. You know, anecdotally, I do know there are repeat customers. We see a lot of the same people, you know, whether it's substance abuse or whatever. You know, most of our extremely regular, I guess I want to say almost like nuisance crimes, you know, the folks who are just committing a lot of your petty larcenies that we see over and over and over, or, you know, things like that. You know, a lot of our trespassing are folks with mental health issues that we deal with over and over, kind of in the criminal side as well. But I can take a look. And one thing I do have to be clear is I can't release any information on names. That information is protected, especially in this situation. But we could look to see how many of these CIT calls that we have actually involve the repeat people.
Yeah, and I imagine. Yeah, I would imagine that, you know, the police doesn't keep track of this. It would probably be more like the hospitals or clinics that they take them to. And I mean, I was just interested in knowing if these people keep getting the need that is needed. So.
Well, I think in many ways, mental health, you know, getting help in mental health is not often all that different, I think, from what we see sometimes in domestic violence. It's a cycle, and it may not be the first, second, third, fourth, it may be the 10th time where they've called the police or called for some sort of service before the help actually starts to take. And that's not all that uncommon, I don't think.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions based on this material? Yeah, Chloe, and then Sujata.
Is there so we read about the internal review of use of force cases. Is there any external review of use of force cases?
It would depend. Obviously, if we were involved in a shooting or something like that, that would be completely reviewed by an external source. You know, we present use of force information to the board annually, kind of a summary, but individual cases being reviewed by anyone else, no.
Go ahead, Sujata.
Thank you. I think this is kind of a segueing questions, and I don't know if it's for Jen or for Chief Hampton or somebody else. What I've learned is that we're talking about small numbers here. It's about 170 calls out of thousands of calls. And then looking at the use of force, it's only about 1/6 of the use of force. So I'm curious to know how this topic was prioritized for one of our first calls. I want to get a sense of if there was thinking of this being one of the biggest problems that we need to discuss, or if it just, you know, was luck of the draw, or some of the thinking about the topic for today.
I will take that one, which is, it is pretty much luck of the draw. And in true confessions, it was feeling about, okay, what can we pull together quickly for our next meeting? Because I personally was overwhelmed between holidays and other things going on. So that's just the plain truth of the matter. So that said, I do think I feel like this is really important for us to be talking about, even though it's a small number of calls. And in a couple of minutes, I'm hoping actually to get Hathaway and Allison to maybe chime in and give some reactions on what they see, because they kind of are on the other side of some of this. Once things are getting into and on the other side of the judicial system for people who do get wrapped up. So this feels like a place where if this body comes up with a recommendation of some alternatives, that it could actually have an impact for people in the community and for our officers if we have recommendations for, you know, other ways of approaching this problem or this issue. But it's a great question. Other queries about this? All right, thanks everyone. And as we move down to the next item on,
Okay, so what are you gonna do now? I want to know if I can chime in right now.
yeah, go ahead, Keith, please.
I think that as we go in this discussion, we forget that the police don't want to do this. And so I think that part of our job is to find ways to get the police out of this. One of the ways of doing that is to bring in mental health people to do that. So, you know, a lot of your larger cities are already doing things like this. And it may be good for us to write them or see what their end reports are to get some information from them. But I didn't hear anyone, which is the subject, talk about how blacks are treated by police as it relates to health and how it relates to mental illness. So we know that those numbers are much different and much higher because we can just look at the jail downtown or who goes in front of the magistrate every night. We know that those numbers are much different than they are for others. You know, I was listening to the radio either Friday or Saturday, and it was talking about this large number of uncontrollable people in Washington, D.C. And one of the guys who called in said that I am just so angry because white people don't do this. This is what normally black people do. So if the police department thinks like that, the reason why probably they get more hits across the head because they don't look for white people to do the same bad things that they think that black people do. So if we have to, I think that we have to deal with the race and the mental health thing and the police thing kind of differently. And we have to put the black issue on the table of how people are treated, the numbers, the difference in how they're treated and vice versa. And so what can we do with that? I think the answer is we find a way for getting the police department, or large numbers of them, out of doing work that they don't do. You know, it's like I was a soldier for a long time. So what I do know is soldiers are trained to kill. Now they're trained to do a whole lot of other things too. What they're trained to do is to kill. Policemen are trained to do certain tactics also. It's a lot of extra work for them to be somebody else 20 minutes of a day and then be themselves, being ready to arrest someone the rest of the time. So it seems as though one of the things that we should look at is how we can get the police department out of that and what are other communities doing that are getting their policemen out of that. I'll answer any questions. You know,
Yeah, thank you, Keith. I absolutely agree that the racial disparity issue is something that that everybody here is prepared and wanting to consider and talk about. And earlier in the meeting, there was a question about, what does that have to do, what are the demographics of the mental health calls, and interest in seeing what those are. Even if we're talking about a small number of overall calls, we still want to see what that looks like if we're able to pull that out. And I think that that's what you've just said is a really good segue into the next topic in talking about these readings that I sent out. And hopefully folks got a chance to look at them. And if you didn't, the world's not going to end, but hopefully you did get a chance to look at them. And as we segue, I first want to say that Eli pointed out to me in a private message that Tracy actually was not with us at our first meeting. I apologize, Tracy, for what I was remembering is you and I were on a different Zoom meeting that was around the same time. So I'm glad that you are here with us tonight. So welcome, Tracy. And then also as we segue, would it be okay, Allison and Hathaway, would you each be willing to just say briefly what this looks like from your position and your experience, and let everybody know what it is you do and how you see this issue of people who are in mental health crisis that then might get caught up in the criminal justice system?
Sure. Well, so I'm a clinical social worker and I work with the Orange County Criminal Justice Resource Department. And so I work with people who are in the county jail. And yes, I agree, the racial disparity piece is huge. We have in our county jail 50 to 60% African American and the rest white. Latinx folks are counted as white in that number, which is problematic. So the Orange County African American Black population is around 12 or 13%. So that's a huge disparity. I mean, one thing that pops in my head is trauma histories that people have, and the trauma response being, I'm sure we've all heard of the fight or flight response. And so getting arrested can be a traumatic experience if you have a diagnosis of PTSD, or even if you don't and you just have some trauma history and you're having a mental health crisis, then your kind of survival reaction might be to fight or flee. And that can result in a criminal charge when it's not really an intentionally criminal offense. It's someone just trying to survive or someone dealing with a mental health, underlying mental health issue. So I see that a lot. I see a lot of resisting arrest charges, kind of sometimes combined with other charges, and every once in a while, just, the isolated resisting arrest charge, which is always kind of a big question mark in my mind of why somebody would only be charged with resisting arrest. But I think, yeah, the police are doing the best that they can responding to mental health calls when that's not what they went into law enforcement training probably to really focus on. I went to school to focus on something like that. So I obviously I have pretty strong feelings about how to respond. And I do support all of these initiatives that we read about, social workers responding or licensed clinicians responding, sometimes with law enforcement and sometimes not. So that's a conversation that we can have as a group, I'm sure. But yeah, does anyone have any other specific questions? Just kind of was talking off the top of my head there a little bit.
Yes, when it comes to the mental health aspect of into that, because to me, I mean, I'm trying to understand. You, for example, you mentioned with the trauma history and the resisting arrest, all those things. So I think that's that's it's bigger than what people think. That's my view. Um, because I mean, I spoke with some mental health folks where they said they would not want to get involved if there is a family dispute, and they don't know those people. And in fact, so you don't know, maybe the other person has a gun, you know, that they have any type of weapons. Who knows how it may go down, right? And the police officer is probably the best person to deal with it. Now, that's a mental health person telling me this, right? But in my mind, I'm thinking, hey, we need both. And the question is, you know, how can we get both into this situation? That was one of the reasons that I asked the questions earlier about whether or not the police officers actually receive the proper and enough, you know, training to actually deal with it, because the police officer within 5 minutes, they have to respond something. They have to be mental health person right away, and they have to play a role of a police officer at the same time. So, and that's the reason, to me, I think it's tough for police officers to deal with. But at the end of the day, you know, how can we transform a police officer and a mental health person into one body? So that's, you know, that's the reason I think. I mean, what do you think? I mean, I don't know. Maybe that's something that you cannot answer, but I was just wondering about that.
Yeah, well, I think it certainly depends on the situation. I think most mental health crises can be resolved with a conversation and, you know, an appropriate response, a therapeutic response. There are some that are really volatile, and there may be weapons involved, and somebody is actively suicidal and is, you know, imminently at risk of taking their own life, and that's really, yeah, the use of some kind of restraint might be needed. I don't know. I mean, we get trained in de-escalation also, and I can't remember the buzzword, but non-violent restraint. That was a long time ago that I had that training when I worked in a group home, but you know, there's, I feel like it would be a small number of situations where a law enforcement presence would be needed for that security level. That's just my sense, based on the number of mental health calls. I think we could look at some more data. The other issue is lack of mental health services. I mean, Hillsborough doesn't even have a mental health facility. When you know, the point about repeat calls for the same person or the same family is just, you know, that I think we need to look at that and where that's happening and why their needs aren't getting met. There's a crisis unit, a facility-based crisis unit in Chapel Hill, but that's it. And they have a mobile crisis unit, but they can have up to 2 hours to respond to a crisis, which, you know, that's, does that even qualify as a crisis if they can respond 2 hours later? So yeah, it's a big problem and a big gap in our community.
Allison, I just have a quick question, and then Hathaway, I want you to go. Sorry, I just had a quick question. When you're referring to the mobile crisis response, is that the crisis response team that was part of the Partnership to End Homelessness Gap study that funding was found for, or is that totally different? I think that.
Yeah, so I was talking so Freedom House has a mobile crisis.
Okay.
Response.
I'm thinking about something different. So
right. You're probably thinking
I apologize.
Street outreach team. That's okay. And
yes.
then Chapel Hill has a crisis response.
Yes.
Chapel Hill Police Department has a crisis.
Okay.
response unit also of clinicians.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Hathaway.
Hey everyone, Hathaway Pendergrass. I'm a district court judge in Orange and Chatham, and I work every day with Allison. Have the pleasure of working every day with Allison. I mean, I think it all starts from the same thing what Keith was saying, and what so many of us are interested in, and why we're part of this is that institutional racism runs deep in everything that we touch, from the court system to town hall, to our schools, to our law enforcement. It's just part of the fabric of our country. And so being intentional and trying to address and drive that out takes day to day, hour by hour, case by case work. I see as a judge in Orange County, we have every Friday, we have hospital hearings, because UNC has an IBC where the folks who the chief is talking about, they'll get committed to UNC or over in Raleigh or Wake County. And when they get committed, they have the opportunity to have a hearing. And I'm usually that judge. That's usually the newest judge gets that. And the overwhelming majority of folks who end up having hearings are white. And I don't read, I sign orders as well, because they'll continue cases, they'll work things out. But folks who are having hearings, certainly the folks I only deal with, overwhelming majority have been white. So you think about how we treat and categorize mental health needs and assessments and breaks. That's a part of the institutional piece that we're talking about of how we determine is somebody going through a mental health break and who's making that determination. So that's on Fridays, but every single day when I'm doing first appearances, I'm touching issues of mental health and how we can treat it, and how the officers have had to make split decisions. I mean, I feel like so often a judge is like kind of that Monday morning quarterback where you can say, well, you should have done this, that, and the other. You're not doing that split second thing. But when you're doing first appearances, for instance, that's when somebody, what we call first appearances, that's when somebody is in custody and we're trying to determine what to do with them, whether to release them, whether to keep them there based upon their charge, whether to get them some type of treatment, and not treating somebody the exact same way if they're charged with something, if they have a substance abuse issue or a mental health issue or none of those. You cannot treat them all the same way. You can't, because you got to treat the underlying problem. To be able to find out that underlying problem, that's a huge issue. We benefit from the Criminal Justice Resource Department that Orange has. We don't have that in Chatham, where I'm also a judge. And in that group it's run by Caitlin Finhagen, and we have a pretrial manager and Ted Dorsey, and we have a wonderful. I was looking at your title actually, Allison. I just had it in my mind. Your actual title is Criminal Case Assessment Specialist, correct? Is that right?
Well, I just changed it, thank goodness, to clinical coordinator.
Clinical coordinator. So we're able to utilize Allison's social work background to determine what we can do with someone, such as if someone needs to be hospitalized, if someone needs to go get immediate detox treatment, and not just setting a bond and moving on. And that is usually done in a 5 to 10 minute determination. And you can't do that. How can you possibly understand somebody in 5 to 10 minutes? You have to have multiple people working on it. And in many jurisdictions, it's literally the prosecutor that says, this person's in charge with X, their bond is Y, this is what we're asking. And the defense attorney says, we don't want that. You don't know anything about that person. Our Criminal Justice Resource Department tells us this person is this age, they work here, this is their family here in town. This is what their record is. I know them. I've worked with them. They tried X treatment. It didn't work. They tried Y treatment. It didn't work. And that's honestly some of the hardest stuff that I have to do every single day, is taking that time to try to understand this human who's before me, so we can create the most specific type of response to that person that would benefit them, their life, the victim, and our community. And I can't do that unless I have folks who are multiple people engaged. I think about what the chief is talking about what officers are lacking for training. I mean, the whole fallacy of the whole system is we're all human beings. I mean, I'm not a social worker. I don't know. I don't have the training that Allison does, so I have to utilize her brain. I have to in making my decisions. So for me, when I read through all the different readings, the Cahoots program out of Eugene, was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. I clicked on the link and it said, and Chief was talking about it, about availability. It has a phone number on there. It says 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Somebody's funding that, obviously, to get that to work. That sounds amazing. I mean, the idea that an officer can show up with a social worker and somebody from the community who knows this family, that 3-person response is the aspirational response in my mind. And it's how, and I think this is what this group is about. This is our aspirational and realistic, but aspirational push here for what we want our community to look like. And I know that Chief Hampton and his police department works super hard, but just like me, I can improve every single day. All of us can improve. Mayor Weaver can improve every single day. Just taking some of these simple readings has just been amazing. It's just been great to get a different aspect of what Keith was talking about, what other cities are doing. Big cities are doing a lot of different stuff. And I do think that we can make an impact just in our own community that can spread. I'll give you the example. The Criminal Justice Resource Department is the example to the majority of judicial districts in our state of what we're doing right. When I talk to the school government, they tell me consistently, we wish other counties had what you have. So we can do it. Just imagine it, putting this into work. So I'm sorry. I got really excited about this, and it's good that I don't see Keith. It's good to hear your voice though.
Yeah, you and his team.
Thank you, Hathaway. Go ahead, Chief Hampton.
Judge Pendergrass, this is a question for you, and this is just for my own knowledge. There's an assumption among at least law enforcement that once someone goes to court, part of the adjudication process is that the court can require them to go get some sort of help. Is that accurate?
That's completely accurate. And that's on the back end. And by the time, it's difficult to make that determination correctly, but by the time you get to that, that's either a plea or a trial. That attorney, that the folks who are in the system, they've had even more ability to understand who this person is. So you can maybe get to that better answer. You can get to the correct response maybe more efficiently at the end. The tougher piece has been at the beginning. Like, how do we help? Especially, we want to our jail population. I saw our stat at the end in December was down 64% from last year, and during the pandemic, it's been down up to. Talked to Judge Bedore about this, up to 75% at times, and that's a combination of lots of things, including COVID. But keeping that number as low as it is and we haven't had those numbers before. I think that's a challenge that we have to consider to keep going. It's not even an improvement on. And to be able to do that for what Chief is talking about, finding the alternatives at the beginning, we lean on folks like Allison Zirkle, like Ted Dorsey, the Criminal Justice Resource Department to help us find those outlets because, we do have time where Allison and I had a case recently where someone kind of fell in this, I'll call it this valley of non-response, where their age was as such that they weren't a juvenile, so I couldn't get them juvenile services that they would be available to. they had not been kicked out of a treatment program, so I couldn't get them into a different one. So they kind of just fell. And Allison, I'm sure you remember who we're talking about, and ended up, letting them out, and they picked up new charges, so they're back in. So we're trying to find them new things. It's so difficult to find the perfect fit, and there's not enough funding in the state to get folks to places, because a lot of times we're talking about who folks don't have money for treatment. They have barely enough money to pay their rent and their bills. How in the world are they going to, especially if Medicaid has not been expanded, how are they going to afford this super clinic for them that costs thousands upon thousands of dollars and they don't have certain insurance? But that's a really long answer to say that we can order all of these things to treat that human being, because that's the other piece. I mean, just treating that person to provide them with that service, that's what we're trying to do in so many instances, at the front and at the end. And we can order that. I mean, we can order that. What you're talking about, Chief, and for folks who don't know, a lot of that is, I might send it somebody to on a DWI, for instance, talking about substances, for instance, for 120 days in jail and suspend the sentence, so they're not going to jail. But during that, while they're on probation, they've got to go to get some type of treatment, and because they're trying to treat that underlying issue versus just saying, you're going to go to jail. That's it.
Well, and just to clarify, and as a follow-up too, and thank you for that, is, another aspect of this for folks to keep in mind is there are times when officers are going to charge somebody because they can't find anything else to do, in the hopes that it will get this person help. In the information we provided, one of the anecdotal examples was a young lady who was a repeat huffer. She would take compressed air, and she was at a Airbnb, and the owners called because they were concerned. And obviously she had a huge problem. We tried to take her to the hospital. Hospital basically said, "Don't bring her back in here. We can't do anything for her." And, the officer at that point, what can he do? His only choice was to essentially charge her with a very minor kind of nothing charge. And his thought process was, well, maybe the courts will make this person go get help. I can remember as a detective sergeant in Durham, I had a situation just like that. We had a lady who had an extreme mental health problem, but would not go get any help. Wasn't to the level of necessarily being a danger to herself. And, actually worked with a judge, and she was doing some criminal things. We ended up charging her with one of them, with the whole thought process of at least maybe ordering her to get some help on the back end. That it didn't end up working, unfortunately, in that case. But I think that's something to keep in mind too, is sometimes we see these charges happen because an officer at 2:00 in the morning is out of options and just doesn't have a way around the problem, and is hoping to maybe get that help on the back end, if nothing else.
Which seems like what we were talking about earlier about if there's a different alternative to send somebody to outside of charging them, because the other science or the math and statistic we've been learning about is once folks are in jail for 3 days, that's the magic number for just losing a job, losing housing, the family's impacted, and trying to figure out that alternative before any of that occurs is a pressing need, and it's one that's always on my mind.
And most of these that I've seen have been citation situations, not custodial. They scratch them a citation to at least hopefully get them some help.
So they're in the system, so there could be eventually recommendations, what you're saying. Okay, so they just show up in court, yeah.
Thank y'all. That was really illuminating. I, for one, have going to be processing that, I know, for some time. And there's
I'm sorry. I felt like I was just kind of winding up and just letting that one go. I'm sorry, Mayor Weaver.
No, it's great. It's great. I want to highlight two things. Hopefully I know there were two things. Let's see if I can interpret my notes properly before we carry the conversation forward. But one of them really is that exchange that Chief Hampton and Hathaway just had. about, you know, just yes, we are fortunate here locally that we have some supports that are not available in other locations, but overall there's the lack of options that kind of all parties are dealing with when they're when there's someone in crisis that way is certainly a big problem. And I don't think that any of us are, you know, we're ignorant to that coming into this, but I think to have that, just to have that described to us so specifically is really, really helpful. Thank you. And the other thing is I just want to put a pin in what Hathaway said, what you said when you first started talking was just about how it seems like that there is, so in one of the articles we read, I think it was the Brookings article, which I thought was a kind of a great overview of all the incumbent parts of this issue. We're talking about how African Americans overall tend to have less, I'm not sure how they phrased it to be honest, but I think less access to mental health resources. And you're saying that when you're on those Fridays where people have been identified as needing some mental health assistance, that those are overwhelmingly white. But, and so it could be that Black people in this community are getting criminalized when what they might need is some mental health assistance. Is that what you were trying to say, Hathaway? Or am I misinterpreting?
So, it's that kind of mix of how does the community in general characterize somebody when they see somebody on the street? It's the same thing that Keith said about when he listened to the radio about somebody being like, this is not how a certain type of person acts. That's all built in on your biases. And so who you call determines how that's going to be responded to. Mm-hmm. And that's built in through from that human who's making that call to the person who's receiving it, to who's responding, even the specific person who's responding. Then how is that characterized? Is that person going to go get hospitalized, or are they taken to the jail? And if they go to the jail, if they go to the hospital, do they feel empowered enough to say, I deserve a hearing on this? It's all of it. That's why I really started with the idea of looking at the institutional piece of all of this and what's built in and race, and how there's always this somebody's touching it, and it all determines what your bias is when you're touching it along the way and where it moves. And what I see is I don't look at the entire numbers of folks who are in the hospital. But the folks who are coming actually before me requesting a hearing have predominantly been white.
Thank you. So I'm just looking at the time, and I want to be mindful of everyone's time, and I want to end by 9. I think if people have questions or reactions to anything that Allison or Hathaway or Chief Hampton said in this last exchange, I think you should feel free to ask those too. And let's talk about these articles some. And I think this is a place because this can feel very discouraging, I think. And it is heavy and difficult, but really to remember that I think this is an opportunity to be aspirational. And that we might think that there are other people that might help us. Trying to think of how to phrase this correctly. We might have an aspirational goal of what we think the ideal would be, and say, let's try and do this here in Hillsborough. And it could be that. The other folks looking at that on the other side of that recommendation might say, well, maybe we can't do that precise thing due to our specific context, but here is how we might be able to put something else together similar that would kind of get at the same idea. So all of that is to say, don't be afraid of being aspirational. I think that this is an opportunity to think big and look at some of these other models and some thoughts and reactions to them. Is it? Yeah, Allison.
Sorry, I was trying to give a little space. But, I mean, one thing that I think is encouraging is that the Criminal Justice Resource Department was only created about 5 years ago. I mean, a couple other programs have been in the court system longer, but you know, we shouldn't be looking to the criminal justice system, I'm stating the obvious, to address mental health. And whether it's law enforcement responding or whether it's, you know, me meeting with somebody after they're arrested, whether it's hoping that if by charging somebody that will get them the help that they need, that's just like a statement on what's missing. And if we can fund a department in our county to work with people who are justice involved, then surely we can come up with resources to fund something else to help people who are not justice involved, and to try to put in place, you know, a crisis response system or more of a community response network or something. It just seems like we can do it if we all work together. So, you know, I feel encouraged. I mean, we have a lot of resources in Hillsborough and Orange County. We have a lot of wealthy people and institutions. I know that everyone talks about budget constraints all the time, but things are there that can be shifted around. So I just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you. Sujata.
I wanted to ask Allison a follow-up question to that comment. I was just curious if you have an idea of the funding for that, whether it comes all from Orange County budget or grants or private donations, if you have an idea of the makeup.
Yeah. My position is funded, I don't know all the technicalities, but by money from Cardinal Innovations. So that comes from the state, the Division of Mental Health, or the state has mental health or behavioral health funding, and each county has a pocket of money for mental health services that they can use how they see fit. There's technical terms for this that I'm really bad at remembering, but anyway, that's how my position is funded. So, so Cardinal Innovations, does everybody know what, I mean, does anyone want me to explain Cardinal Innovations?
Yeah, why don't you say what that is?
So Cardinal Innovations is the local management entity / managed care organization that manages the funding for all of for services for people who have Medicaid or for people who are uninsured and low income. So, and Cardinal oversees these services in Orange County, Alamance County, Person County, like several counties in this area. Durham has a different management entity called Alliance. So it gets to be problematic if someone is a resident of Durham County and trying to access services because they happen to be in, just moved to Orange County. It's really can drive a person crazy. But anyway, that's where my funding comes from. The other positions I think are county funded. There's some grant funding. We have a local reentry council that is, I think, funded through DPS, Department of Public Safety, and a grant associated with that.
And DPS is a state agency.
Yeah, you don't normally want to start getting fundraising from your county. They don't have any money.
Yeah, Hooper.
Yeah, this is kind of a question for, I guess, Chief Hampton and Allison and Hathaway. I've been turning over my head after reading this Brookings Institute article and the stuff about cahoots, but just kind of wondering how, obviously, like, I'm sure that mental health issues and persistent drug abuse issues, like, you know, the opiate crisis in North Carolina, have like a lot of overlap. And I'm wondering how, in terms of like employment and these kinds of like the idea that like, oh, if we get a charge, we can get someone help, but then you have like the attendant problem of being employed afterwards with the charge following you. And I'm just wondering if there's anything that any of y'all know about that are ways that someone can, like, given the system that we currently have, like obviously we're going to try to change that, but like, are there ways that these people can get help now without a charge following them, if that makes sense? I know that Allison said there's not a mental health clinic or center here in town. I saw that there's a methadone clinic, but what other options do people have, I guess? Because I feel like, you know, a drug addiction problem is going to bleed into mental health issues a lot.
I mean, I can speak to parts of it, and you know, others may be much more knowledgeable than I am. You know, obviously, I mean, the idea of the whole voluntary commitment process is part of that. They can go to the hospital, they can go to the ER to seek treatment. You know, there are providers out there, but that also speaks to what somebody else said before, is, you know, socioeconomics will come into play, and certain groups are, you know, able to pay for mental intervention services that other groups aren't going to have access to. You know, I think Cardinal Innovations provides a lot of services to folks who are in need, so that option is there. So there are some places out there folks can go, but, you know, not a whole lot of good options right off the top.
Yeah, I think that part of the problem sometimes is that the providers that are out there aren't as flexible or adaptable as they could be to help somebody who can't make it to an appointment in Chapel Hill or misses an appointment. And if they miss 3 appointments, you know, they're terminated from services, you know, that kind of thing. But we do have Freedom House in Chapel Hill, which provides mental health and substance use treatment for people who are indigent. So there's state funding for people who can't afford to pay for services. And then UNC has a bunch of outpatient programs also. And then we have 2 halfway houses, a men's halfway house and a women's halfway house in Chapel Hill, also associated with Freedom House. Their beds are usually full. And then there's also, like I said before, facility-based crisis is a detox facility in Chapel Hill, associated like with Freedom House, that's open 24/7. And mostly people go there for detox services. But people can also go there if they're in a mental health crisis. If they don't quite meet the threshold for an involuntary commitment, they can present at Freedom House and get assessed and admitted and stabilized for a few days.
Yeah, Hooper, when I was in private practice, I would send clients before there's any criminal aspect to it. I just been working with them, whether it's in a domestic case or other representation, where I've told them, and they would go to Freedom House, and that would be a really good outlet. Those are organizations are in different counties, and it all really depends on how well run it is. Like, we were very fortunate; we have a really good Freedom House here, but also the same thing we're talking about. You know, if there's not a bed, someone who doesn't have transportation, how are they going to get to a different county, or will they even be allowed if they're not a resident? So it's there are options there, but they are limited for sure.
Something else just to add, to throw to it too, is you know, speaking to what Hooper said about, you know, alternatives to arrest. You know, from my experience, and again, anecdotally looking at a lot of the reports, a lot of the folks that we end up dealing with have been involved in our systems already in some way. Either they've got a social worker already assigned to them for other things, or they've had other interactions with the, not necessarily the criminal justice system, but just our governmental system. So, you know, a lot of times I think that by the time they get to where law enforcement is getting involved, we're kind of starting to run out of options. You know, we've already tried other referrals and things, unfortunately.
Mark?
Yes, that was a lot to absorb. uh, I mean, this is great. This is outstanding. So, what I'm trying to understand is that there is a problem. All right. Number one, the problem is recognized. Okay. We all can see that there was a problem. Okay. And to me, and based on what has been said so far, it is a process, as Hadori mentioned. It's a process saying that from point A to point Z, throughout the process, the decision is made that some people will be put out and other food will receive the service, right? So, and that's where the bias comes from. Now, I have a bunch of questions, but what I'm trying to understand is that I had a snake, right? I moved to North Carolina. It's gonna be short. I had a snake in my driveway. Listen to this very carefully. I had a snake in my driveway. Well, I was not used to having snakes around. So it was a big snake. So I called 911. I mean, that was the stupidest thing that I could ever, but in my mind, that was the best thing in the world. I could call 911 and somebody on the phone, I never forget this. I will never forget that anyway. Somebody on the phone, and so the person say, oh, hold on 1 second. I'm going to contact the animal, whatever service department, and they will get in touch with you, okay? So now, what I'm trying to say is this. Instead of charging the person whenever there is an issue with, with the family member, whatever it is, then again, it's gonna come to a different issue, but let me finish with this one. If the police officer can actually recognize that this person is mentally ill person, there should be, in my view, a department where that police officer can actually refer the person, right? And there is where I think that the lack of resources comes in based on what has been mentioned. Now, the question is, though, how can we actually have a department or a center, right, that actually deals with mental health, where the people can actually get the help? That's I think, to me, I think the best thing that we can do is by asking the question first: how does I would say the government itself actually solve the problem, right? And to me, I think that's a big start, because my experience with the snake, I think that can also apply to, instead of the police officer, like the police officer will know that they have, because that's where when you mentioned with the hospital hearings, right? Somewhere along the way, the majority of the white folks, they already know the system, okay? They already know the system, because they're gonna see the judge, and you know what I'm saying. So how come the majority is white? There has to be some knowledge that has been transmitted through that said, okay, if you are in this situation, and that's what. On the other hand, the minority folks, the black folks, they don't know. They don't have the resources. They don't have the help. So I think that can be solved, and it's not, to me, it's just a matter of trying to find a way to get it done. I think it is a process issue. That's what I wanted to mention into that aspect.
Thank you, Mark. And you're reminding me of one of the other, I thought, great examples that was in that Brookings article that's happening in Maryland, was with the thing called Warmline, where there's the people who are getting the 911 calls it sounded like they were routing, if they could assess that it was some kind of mental health crisis, then they were routing those calls to a different set of I'm going to call them 911 call responders, who were specially trained with then getting those people connected with sources, et cetera, et cetera. Again, we're going to face special challenges when we're thinking about like the town of Hillsborough versus a region, versus, but I think it's still worth, like, that's a pretty powerful example of, kind of at the very front end, when someone's having an issue, what is that first contact and how does that get routed? We have 3 minutes left.
Mayor, if I
Yeah.
could just add one thing
Yes,
really quickly, just
please.
to follow that really briefly, I want to make sure everybody understands. There is a lot of triage that does happen at the 911 call. So, again, if they know somebody's having some sort of mental health crisis that does not need law enforcement, they're going to refer other resources and do other things. So we do some of that. So I just want to make sure folks know that there is some triage that happens to 911 calls. Not all the mental health calls get a police officer.
Thank you.
So
for
what would
joining
you
that.
do
That's
about
really
that snake?
important.
Mark, I have pulled 4 or 5 snakes out of people's houses. I've pulled mice, I've pulled bats, and I've pulled a raccoon out of someone's house. Unfortunately, I don't know what animal control folks they got you to, but I've never found one that would respond to that stuff.
So,
And-
having said that, the animal control, they called me back after, the police officer didn't show up, but the animal control, they responded, they called me back and they said, okay, don't worry about it. It's just gonna go away.
Can I ask real quick if Chief Hampton, what is I know that some of the data you provided kind of alluded to some assumptions we could make about time of day, things like that. But so I'm thinking about that triaging that happens. Does that just wondering, say, at 2 a.m, what the options are for those 911 folks that are triaging if they're trying to help someone, before they send. I'm not articulating that well, but you get my question?
Well, there's like crisis lines and things like that I know they can refer folks to. It all depends on the nature. A lot of times there are folks who are having some sort of substance abuse, mental health problem that get an ambulance, not a police car. So it just varies. I don't know that their resources are all that different during the day or at night. It's limited to what they can refer. It just depends on, sometimes they may send a police car, sometimes they may send an ambulance. Sometimes they may just talk to somebody and give them advice. I think that happens as well. Their specific protocols, though, I couldn't speak to.
Thank you. Chloe, were you raising your hand?
I was, but if we're close to time, I guess I could go.
Go for it.
Okay. I do think that, you said that Hillsborough was, had some specific considerations. I think the models we read about were for larger towns, and I was persuaded by what Chief Hampton said. These specific calls are certainly not the only calls that would come in for people in crisis, but the calls that do reach the police department now are only happening once every 4 days. And so it'd be really hard to have people funded to be on call 24/7 for one call every 4 days. Nobody would fund that for very long. So that's one thing I think we would have to address if we were going to talk about this more deeply. And another, I think that we've talked about how the demographic information was missing. Another piece that I think is missing to help us kind of flesh out the need here in Hillsborough for an alternative type program is the perspective from people who have been in crisis and police have responded to them, or witness perspectives. The data provided by Chief Hampton was really illuminating, but there is a whole nother, there's just a whole nother perspective that without that, I don't feel like I can make a good call on whether or not this kind of alternative model is actually needed here. And it kind of goes to my question about, was there some sort of external review on force abuse cases? Is there some citizen group or how can we hear from citizens about the needs from the community from a different perspective to really make a fully informed decision? Or I don't know what kind of decision we're going to make, but if we are going to make a decision about whether or not to recommend such a thing, I think we need that kind of information as well.
Thank you, Chloe. Really appreciate that.
Here, just to add a piece of data, I know we don't have access to it. I don't even know if we can get it, but it might be good to look at, if we can get any information from some of these providers like Cardinal Innovation or Freedom House about the populations that they're serving. Then that could compare to kind of the data we're getting in the criminal justice system to see if there's any correlation.
Sorry, I'm just writing my notes down before I forget everything. I know, Eli, I know you'll have minutes, but thank you for taking those also. So as we wrap up, I just want to make note of a couple of things that Chloe said here at the end, and then some of the things that have been written in the chat. So one of them is along the aspirational piece. I think that, when we get to the part where we're ready to talk about, the different topics that we discuss and want to make some recommendations, one of the things that we can keep in mind is that there are, the town of Chapel Hill, town of Carborough, like there are other entities that are having similar conversations. And so there could be, when I think about how to get around that 24/7 problem, then I start to think about, well, if we were coordinating among the jurisdictions, then that is an opportunity to think about how we might do that. And I also don't think that is necessarily this group's, I don't think we have to solve that issue. I think that this group's real mission is to think of what kind of community we would like to see and what recommendations we have to get us there. And then it will go to the next step. It's important for us to kind of keep some boundaries, around what we're doing so that we're not just, creating impossible situations. But I do think I don't want to get so bogged down in what feels hard that we aren't being imaginative and thinking big. So I just want to note that Judith says, I think we can start looking at our school systems. This is really important. I think that is a place where that's going to come into our discussions. It is also, the town of Hillsborough really has, we don't do anything with the school systems. We don't have any formal relationship with the school systems. We have a lot of back and forth with the county, but the schools are really their own animal within the county. And so I don't think that means we shouldn't talk about them, but I think it's going to it might get tricky if we start trying to think about recommendations to the schools, but they are going to be having a similar conversation. So I think we can stay in contact with them about what they're doing. And then Mark is saying, I think the issue is more preventative, and I agree. I think that that is so much of, I think that is a shared goal, is, how do we prevent people from taking that first step, that's where something is being criminalized. That's what we want to keep from happening. Any other final comments before we wrap up? Thank you all so much for being here and for your time. This was a great discussion. If you have follow-up thoughts, I hope you won't hesitate to share those with me and or Eli. And if you want us to share those with the whole group, in fact, if you do send any follow-up thoughts, I think what we'll probably say is it okay to share this with the whole group? Because it would be great if you're willing to do so. And if you won't, we won't if you don't want us to, can also honor that. We will also be telling you when the next meeting is. I think that this is generally a pretty good, I'm just looking at, this second Thursday of the month. Is that generally a good meeting evening for folks? As good as any evening meeting can be.
Well, we're Zooming, so it should work.
Everybody needs a Zoom break, Keith. Okay, well, look forward to hearing from us soon. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. Have a nice evening.